Imagine being surrounded by a powerful enemy, with your city on the brink of destruction and no human resources capable of saving you. This was the scenario faced by Hezekiah, a king who had everything to succumb to the pressure of an imminent invasion and a deadly disease. But instead of surrendering, Hezekiah did something extraordinary. He turned to God with a prayer that would completely change his fate and that of an entire nation. In this video, we'll dive into the impressive story of how Hezekiah's unwavering faith and prayer not only saved his life, but also defeated the most feared army of the time. A story of overcoming, humility, pride, and redemption, which shows us how trusting in God can turn even the darkest moments into glorious victories. If you've ever felt at a loss, this story will speak directly to your heart. But before we start, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications bell. That way you'll be sure not to miss any of the biblical productions here. That said, let's get to the story of King Hezekiah. Imagine the scene. The kingdom of Judah was in complete spiritual disorder. The people, who once worshipped God, had strayed far from him. The streets of Jerusalem and the surrounding cities were filled with temples dedicated to false gods, pagan altars on every corner, the smell of sacrifices to idols in the air, while the true temple of God, the one built for the Lord, was practically abandoned. The nation had followed the example of the previous king, Ahaz, who led Judah away from God, plunging the kingdom into a spiritual darkness never seen before. To the people, it seemed as though God had abandoned them. But in the midst of this chaos, a new hope emerged. Hezekiah, a young king of only 25 years, son of Ahaz, but completely different from his father. From the first day of his reign, Hezekiah decided he would not follow in the footsteps of his predecessor. He knew that the only way to restore the glory of Judah was to return to the Lord, the God of his ancestors, and that would require courage and determination. He did not hesitate. He knew that what was at stake was far greater than his throne. It was the destiny of an entire nation. One of Hezekiah's first decisions was bold and dramatic. He ordered the closure of the pagan temples. Imagine the reaction of the people. Many were accustomed to worshiping idols and perhaps even depended on these practices for their daily lives. But Hezekiah knew that Judah would never prosper while it worshipped false gods. So, he gave the order: tear down all the altars, destroy every image and every idol. And so it was done. Altars that had become part of the kingdom's landscape were torn down. Images of foreign gods were destroyed, and the focus began to return to the temple of God, the only place that should be the center of worship. However, Hezekiah's work didn't stop there. He knew that simply destroying the idols wasn't enough. The people of Judah needed to reconnect with the true God. So, he summoned the priests and Levites, those responsible for taking care of the temple, and ordered them to purify the place. For years, the temple had been neglected, left in ruins full of dust and signs of abandonment. The doors were reopened, the altar was restored, the priests began offering sacrifices as in ancient times, and the sound of songs of praise echoed through the halls. But Hezekiah had something even greater in mind. He knew that the nation needed more than just a physical cleaning of the temple. It needed a deep spiritual renewal. That's why he did something bold. He summoned all the people, from the most humble to the leaders of the nation, to celebrate Passover together, something that hadn't been done for many years. Passover, one of the most important events in Israel's history, marked the people's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, and Hezekiah wanted the people to remember this, that God was the deliverer, and that there was still hope for Judah, even in such dark times. Hezekiah didn't stop with his own kingdom. He sent messengers to the tribes of the northern kingdom, Israel, who were also facing their crises, inviting them to participate in this great celebration in Jerusalem. Many rejected the invitation, mocking the idea. But others, touched by the spirit of renewal, joined the people of Judah in worshiping God once again. Passover was celebrated with great joy, and for 7 days the people of Judah dedicated themselves entirely to the Lord, singing, praying, and renewing their faith. Hezekiah led this celebration with great fervor, because he knew that this was the key to restoring the people's relationship with God. Hezekiah was not just a determined king, he was a leader with deep faith. His trust in God guided every one of his decisions. While other kings sought political alliances or military strategies to strengthen the kingdom, Hezekiah chose a different path. He knew that Judah's true strength would not come from armies or riches, but from obedience to the Lord, and that's what he pursued, reforming not only the temple but the hearts of the entire nation. Over time, the nation of Judah began to change. The people who once followed idols now turned their eyes back to the God of Israel. The temple once again became the center of the nation's spiritual life, and Hezekiah's reign became known as a time of renewal, restoration, and a new covenant with the Lord. After a period of great spiritual renewal in Judah, led by Hezekiah, it seemed that things were finally looking up. The people had turned back to God, the temple had been restored, and Passover had been celebrated like never before. But as Judah strengthened its faith, a terrible threat loomed: the mighty Assyrian Empire. Led by Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, this empire was feared by all the nations around. Assyria had a reputation for brutality. When they invaded, they left no stone unturned. Entire cities were destroyed, people were taken captive, and enemy armies stood no chance of resisting. It was in this setting that Hezekiah faced his greatest challenge. Sennacherib began advancing against Judah, rapidly conquering several cities around the kingdom. Each victory brought the enemy's army closer to Jerusalem. The military might of Assyria was immense. They had the most well-equipped and trained army of the time, with experienced soldiers and an unstoppable strategy of destruction. There was no way to halt that advance. When the Assyrian armies finally reached the gates of Jerusalem, the city found itself surrounded. Imagine the panic in the streets. The residents of Jerusalem could see the banners of the enemy troops on the horizon. The sound of Assyrian marches echoed as they set up camp around the city. Jerusalem was completely cut off, with no hope of receiving help from other cities in Judah, all of which had already been devastated. No supplies were coming in, and hunger and thirst began to threaten those within the city walls. To make matters worse, Sennacherib was not just a military leader but a psychological strategist. He sent messengers to Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem with a message of mockery and challenge. The Assyrian messengers shouted from outside the city walls so that everyone could hear, "In whom do you trust? Do you think the God of Hezekiah can save you? No god of the other nations has been able to stop Assyria, neither the gods of Syria nor the gods of Samaria, nor any city we've conquered. And you, what do? You place your hope in this God? He cannot save you." Fear gripped the hearts of the people. The words of the messengers were like sharp arrows, and for many, the situation truly seemed hopeless. Sennacherib was an undefeated king, with countless victories to his name, and his armies had destroyed everything in their path. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, it seemed like the end was near. They had heard stories of how other cities had been plundered, their temples destroyed, their people taken captive, and they feared that the same fate awaited them. Hezekiah, who had led Judah through such a powerful spiritual renewal, now faced a moment of profound testing. He knew that, from a human perspective, the situation was desperate. The city was surrounded, supplies were scarce, and there was no way to resist the military force of Assyria. There were no allied armies on the way, no resources for a prolonged battle. Any king in Hezekiah's position might have succumbed to the pressure and surrendered, trying to negotiate peace, even if it meant submitting to Assyrian rule. But Hezekiah was a different kind of king. He knew that he could not rely on human strength for this battle. The only hope for Jerusalem was in God. Even in the face of Sennacherib's arrogance, who mocked the God of Israel, Hezekiah knew that the Lord was capable of doing the impossible. Instead of giving in to despair, he turned to the temple, the place he had restored with such zeal, and did something that few kings would do in his place. He prayed. In the midst of the greatest crisis of his life and reign, Hezekiah was cornered. The king stood before the crushing power of the Assyrian army, the greatest military force of the time, led by Sennacherib, one of the most feared rulers. Jerusalem was besieged, surrounded by troops ready to destroy everything. Fear hovered over the city like a dark cloud. But while many kings would have succumbed to despair, Hezekiah did something extraordinary. He turned to the only one who could truly save him: God. Hezekiah knew that, humanly speaking, there was no hope. The army of Judah was small and fragile compared to the gigantic Assyrian army. He knew that no ally or military plan could reverse the situation. So, the king made the decision that would change everything. He went to the temple of the Lord. In that sacred place where he had restored the worship of God, Hezekiah prostrated himself. In a gesture of deep despair and humility, he tore his clothes, a sign of mourning and total surrender. At that moment, the powerful king became a humble servant, acknowledging his total dependence on God. With a heavy heart and eyes fixed on heaven, Hezekiah began to pray. But this was no ordinary prayer. He wasn't just praying for protection, he was crying out for divine intervention, asking God to see the mockery of the Assyrians. The enemies were not just attacking Judah, they were insulting God himself. Sennacherib had sent a message to the people of Jerusalem, saying that the God of Hezekiah was no different from the other gods he had already defeated. It wasn't just a military attack, it was blasphemy against the Lord. With his heart broken, Hezekiah gave everything into God's hands. He cried out, "O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and see. Hear all the words of Sennacherib, who has sent his messengers to insult the living God." Hezekiah knew that God's power was greater than any army. He wasn't asking only for the salvation of Jerusalem, but for the glory of God's name. He knew that if Judah were destroyed, the enemies would say that the Lord was incapable of protecting his people. This prayer was not made in secret. The people isolated within the city walls knew their king was praying for them. They knew that Hezekiah wasn't relying on treaties with other kingdoms, but only on God. For them, this prayer represented hope amidst the chaos, a light in the darkness. Imagine the silence that must have taken over Jerusalem as everyone awaited a divine answer. The city was surrounded, the Assyrians were mocking, and in the middle of it all, a king knelt before God's altar, placing his total trust in the Lord of hosts. And it was in this moment of total vulnerability that God responded. The prophet Isaiah, who had already counseled Hezekiah in earlier moments, brought a direct word from the Lord. And what a word it was. "Do not be afraid of the words you have heard," said Isaiah. "I will defeat them without you needing to fight." Imagine the impact of those words. The people, who had been overwhelmed with fear, began to feel a wave of relief. God had spoken, and his word was final. This promise was incredible. God was saying that Judah wouldn't need to lift a sword, that the most powerful army of the time would be defeated without them even fighting. For a king like Hezekiah, who had placed all his hope in the Lord, this was the confirmation that he had made the right choice. Hezekiah hadn't sought an alliance with Egypt, nor relied on his own strength or military wisdom. He chose to trust in God, and God promised deliverance. What is so powerful about this story is the simplicity of Hezekiah's faith. He didn't try to solve the crisis by human means. He didn't seek complex strategies, nor did he try to make deals with other kings. He simply prayed, and that prayer, that total surrender to God, completely changed the course of events. Now, everything was in God's hands. The tension was palpable. The Assyrians were still out there, surrounding the city. Sennacherib still had the arrogance of an invincible king, certain that he would soon destroy Jerusalem. But Hezekiah had something the Assyrians didn't: the promise that the Lord would fight for him. As the people waited anxiously, Hezekiah trusted. He knew that God would never abandon his people and that the glory of the Lord was at stake. Hezekiah prayed not only for himself or his kingdom, but for the name of God to be exalted among the nations. And this faith, this unshakable trust, would be the key to the miracle about to unfold. What Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem didn't know was that God was already at work. The king's prayer had been heard, and the Assyrian army, which saw itself as invincible, was about to witness the power of the true God. Soon, everyone would know that the God of Hezekiah was the God who answers prayers, the God who fights for his people. The tension in Jerusalem was palpable. Inside the city walls, the people waited anxiously for the answer to their king Hezekiah's prayer. Outside, the immense Assyrian army was camped, ready to attack and destroy the city. The siege had lasted for days, and the silence of the night seemed to carry the weight of an impending tragedy. But Hezekiah had something the Assyrians did not: a promise from God. The prophet Isaiah had delivered a clear message. God would fight for Jerusalem, and the people would not need to lift a single sword. And it was on that night, when all seemed lost, that the miracle happened. The Bible describes one of the most powerful acts of divine intervention. While the Assyrians slept in their camps, confident that their victory was certain, something beyond human understanding began to unfold. An angel of the Lord was sent directly into the enemy camp. Without any noise, without battles, without trumpets, this angel executed divine judgment upon the Assyrian army. In the silent darkness, 185,000 soldiers were struck down in a single night. Imagine the scene. The fires were still burning in the camp, but the lives were extinguished without a single soldier drawing his sword. It was not a normal battle. There was no human confrontation. It was the direct manifestation of God's power. Each of those trained and feared soldiers fell without warning. What seemed like a sure victory for Assyria was transformed into a defeat with no natural explanation. The next morning, the sunlight revealed the devastation. Sennacherib, the king who had defied the God of Israel, awoke to find his army decimated. What he saw was unbelievable. Bodies lay scattered throughout the camp, terror and shock spreading among the few soldiers who remained. What was once an unstoppable force had now become a scene of death and defeat. Sennacherib's pride, the same pride that led him to insult the God of Hezekiah, was crushed. He, who had promised to destroy Jerusalem and take its people captive, now found himself with no other option but to order an immediate retreat. With a humbled heart and shame on his face, Sennacherib left the plains of Judah and returned to Nineveh, his capital. He had left for war, certain of his victory, but returned in disgrace, with a shattered army. God's power had been demonstrated so clearly and so absolutely that neither he nor any other king could deny that the Lord of Hezekiah was the true God. No other god or nation had been able to stop the Assyrians, but the God of Israel did so without the need for a single arrow. Jerusalem, which had been on the brink of destruction, was now safe. The people who had once feared for their lives now saw before them the living proof of God's power. The streets, which had been silent in anticipation, suddenly filled with joy and celebration. Hezekiah, who had prostrated himself in the temple in prayer, now saw God's answer in a clear and powerful way. The trust he had placed in the Lord was rewarded in an extraordinary manner. Jerusalem was saved not by armies but by the strong arm of God. This miracle was not just a military victory. It was a demonstration to all nations that the God of Israel is not like other gods. He is not made of stone or wood, and he is not limited by human power. He is the living God, sovereign over all, capable of doing the impossible. He defends his people and answers the prayers of those who trust in him. The story of this event spread quickly. Reports of how an unbeatable army was defeated without a single battle reached the neighboring nations. Hezekiah, the king who placed his faith entirely in God, was remembered as the leader who witnessed one of the greatest miracles of all time. The name of God was exalted not only in Judah, but throughout the known world. This divine intervention was a milestone in the history of Israel, showing that when everything seems lost, when enemies grow stronger and fear takes hold, God is able to act in a supernatural way. Hezekiah knew this, and his unshakable faith brought deliverance not only for him, but for an entire nation. Thus, the city that had been surrounded and on the verge of destruction became the stage for one of the most impressive manifestations of God's power. Once again, the story of Hezekiah teaches us that when we trust completely in the Lord, he is able to turn the impossible into reality and defeat even the most powerful enemy with a single action of his hand. Even after the miraculous victory over the Assyrians, Hezekiah's life was about to face another challenge. This time not an external threat but an internal battle against death. The king, who had experienced God's powerful intervention, now found himself in a deeply personal and delicate situation. Shortly after Sennacherib's retreat, Hezekiah was struck by a terminal illness. The Bible does not specify the exact nature of this illness, but we know it was severe enough to bring Hezekiah to the brink of death. The once vigorous and pious king, who had led his people through great crises, was now physically debilitated, unable to govern and worried about the future of his kingdom. Fear and uncertainty hovered over the palace. And to make matters worse, the prophet Isaiah, the same one who had brought the message of victory over the Assyrians, arrived with devastating news. "Put your house in order, for you are going to die and will not recover." Imagine the pain Hezekiah must have felt upon hearing these words. It wasn't just the fear of death, but the feeling that his time as Judah's leader had come to an abrupt end, while he still felt there was much left to accomplish. Isaiah offered no hope. He was clear and direct. It was time for Hezekiah to prepare for death. For anyone, this would be a final blow. Many would have accepted this message and resigned themselves to their fate. But Hezekiah, true to his nature, was not ready to give up. He had seen God's power act before, and he knew that even in impossible situations God could intervene. So once again, Hezekiah did what he knew best. He prayed. But this was no ordinary prayer. It was a desperate prayer, full of tears and cries. Lying on his bed, turned toward the wall, isolated from everyone, he wept before God. He didn't seek political alliances or ask for counsel. His only hope was in the Lord. Hezekiah reminded God of his faithfulness over the years, of how he had led Judah with a righteous heart, always striving to do what was right in God's eyes. He cried out for more time, for more years to fulfill his calling and continue serving his people and the Lord. Hezekiah's prayer was not just a request for healing. It reflected his deep connection with God, his desire to live not for himself, but to continue being an instrument in the Lord's hands. The tears he shed were not of despair, but of trust. Trust that the same God who had defeated the Assyrian army could also intervene in his health. And God, in his infinite mercy, heard Hezekiah's cry. Before Isaiah could even leave the palace, the Lord gave him a new message. "Go back and tell Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will add 15 years to your life." Imagine the scene. Isaiah, who had just announced Hezekiah's impending death, now returned with the opposite message. What seemed like the end for Hezekiah turned into a new beginning. God would not only heal Hezekiah, but also grant him 15 more years of life. It was a divine gift, a new opportunity to continue what he had started. But God didn't stop there. To confirm the promise and ensure that Hezekiah knew this miracle was truly an act of God, the Lord offered an extraordinary sign, a cosmic miracle. Hezekiah, still weak in his bed, received a message from God through Isaiah. The Lord would make the shadow of the sun move back 10 steps. This backward movement of the shadow, something no human could control, would be proof that God was not only in control of Hezekiah's life, but of time itself. And so it happened. Before the eyes of the king and his servants, the shadow of the sun, which normally advanced, moved backward. A visible and undeniable sign that the God who controls the universe had intervened in the natural course of time to demonstrate his power. For Hezekiah, this sign was not just confirmation of his healing, but proof that God was with him at every step of his life. Hezekiah was healed. The king who had been on the brink of death rose from his bed with renewed strength and vitality. The additional years God granted him were a gift not only for him, but for the entire nation of Judah. Hezekiah had much more to accomplish, and now, with the blessing of 15 more years, he could continue governing and leading his people with justice and righteousness. This defining moment in Hezekiah's life teaches us a powerful lesson about prayer, faith, and the sovereignty of God. Even when everything seems lost, even when death seems imminent, God can intervene in miraculous ways. He is not limited by circumstances or time. And when his people cry out sincerely, he hears and responds, often in ways beyond what we can imagine. Hezekiah's story reminds us that just as God moved the shadow of the sun, he is able to move heaven and earth to answer the prayers of his faithful servants. The story of Hezekiah seemed to reach its climax with his miraculous healing and the victory over the Assyrians. God had extended his life by 15 years, and Judah was experiencing a period of peace and prosperity. However, Hezekiah's path, like that of many great leaders, would not be free of spiritual challenges. In the last years of his life, Hezekiah made a mistake that, while it didn't erase his legacy, brought important lessons about pride and humility. As the years passed, the king of Judah began to enjoy unprecedented prosperity. The nation was secure, its coffers full, and Hezekiah's name was respected among all the surrounding nations. He had become a powerful figure, and the splendor of Judah began to attract the attention of other kingdoms, including Babylon. It was in this context that Babylonian envoys were sent to Jerusalem under the pretense of a diplomatic visit. Hezekiah, now more confident in his reign and enjoying his fame, made a crucial mistake. Instead of recognizing that all his prosperity came from God, he allowed pride to take root in his heart. When the Babylonian envoys arrived, Hezekiah decided to show them all the treasures of Judah. He opened the royal storehouses, displaying the kingdom's wealth: silver, gold, spices, precious oils, and even the sacred items of the temple. It was an impressive display of power and wealth. But what seemed like a simple act of hospitality actually revealed something deeper in Hezekiah's heart: pride. He temporarily distanced himself from the humility that had characterized him in his most difficult moments. The man who had once prostrated himself in prayer before God now allowed the shine of riches and human power to overshadow his dependence on the Lord. It was in this moment of pride that God, in his mercy, intervened once again. The prophet Isaiah, who had been both a messenger of good news and warnings to Hezekiah, came to him once again with a clear message. "What did these men see in your palace?" Hezekiah, unaware of the gravity of his actions, responded, "They saw everything. There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them." It was then that Isaiah delivered a harsh warning from God. "The days are coming when everything in your palace and all that your ancestors have stored up until now will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left. Even some of your descendants will be taken and serve as eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Isaiah's prophecy was a devastating blow to Hezekiah. He realized that in his pride he had opened the door to Judah's future downfall. The kingdom he had fought so hard to protect would one day face captivity and desolation. The Babylonians, who had initially come as visitors, would one day become the conquerors of Judah. However, upon receiving this warning, Hezekiah did something that revealed the true essence of his character. He humbled himself before God. He acknowledged his mistake and turned his heart back to the Lord, fully aware that he had strayed from the humility that had sustained him for so long. Hezekiah did not try to justify his actions, nor did he rebel against God's word. Instead, he accepted the correction and prostrated himself before the Lord, knowing that the only way to restore his relationship with God was through humility. God, seeing Hezekiah's repentant heart, granted peace to his reign for the remainder of his days. Although Judah's future was sealed to face Babylonian captivity, Hezekiah was spared from witnessing that tragedy in his lifetime. He was able to finish his reign with dignity, remembered by his people not for his mistakes but for his faith and the way he led the nation through great challenges. Hezekiah's legacy is not one of perfection, but of unshakable faith and humility. He was a king who made mistakes like all men, but he was also a man who knew how to bow before God when necessary. He is not remembered for his wealth or military power, but for his total trust in the Lord, especially during the darkest moments. Hezekiah knew that even when he failed, God was always ready to hear the cry of a truly repentant heart. His life teaches us that even when we achieve great victories, the danger of pride is always lurking. The same king who saw God defeat an army of 185,000 soldiers with just one angel, and who was healed from a deadly illness, had to learn that true greatness is not found in what we possess, but in our willingness to humble ourselves before God. Hezekiah reminds us that pride can blind us, but humility always leads us back to the Lord's presence. In the end, Hezekiah's legacy is a testimony to God's grace. He was one of Judah's greatest kings not for his material achievements, but for his faith and his deep relationship with God. His prayer not only changed his personal destiny, it changed the destiny of an entire nation. He proved that with faith we can move mountains, or even see the shadow of the sun move backward in the sky. Let me know in the comments what lessons you learned from this story. May God bless your life. See you in the next video.